The night in Manhattan seemed perfect, a glass mirror reflecting the city's tranquil lights. But at 10:47 p.m., in the basement of the Vertex Tower, time broke in half. Erratic sparks exploded from an electrical panel hastily installed by a third-party team that never received adequate training. The wire, insulated with cheap tape, melted like wax, and the electrical arc jumped, briefly illuminating the ignored warning sign. Flammable materials, storage prohibited. The fire started small, a hungry cub, but found sustenance in seconds. Detergents, industrial solvents, alcohol-soaked rags. The combustion was instantaneous, a muffled explosion that bulged the walls of the storage room. The flames, now voracious, advanced through ventilation ducts lined with flammable foam, bypassing containment systems that had never been tested. Jack Morrison, pushing his cleaning cart down the deserted basement hallway, smelled it first. Not ordinary smoke, but that acidic, metallic scent every firefighter knows. The announcement of tragedy. His gaze fixed on the end of the hallway, where a thick cloud was forming like a specter. Suddenly, an explosion. The metal door of the storage room was hurled like a projectile, flying across the hallway and hitting a maintenance worker emerging from the bathroom. His body was slammed against the opposite wall, crushed before he could even scream. Jack instinctively threw himself to the ground, his eardrums ringing. He looked up and saw the flames running through the ducts, like incandescent snakes, advancing in all directions. The alarm system, he thought, but hope died before the sentence finished. The security panel next to it was already a block of melted plastic. In the basement monitoring center, two operators stared, stunned, at the cameras that flickered and went out, one after another. The security chief grabbed the emergency phone. Silence. The line had been cut by the heat. Before he could react, the ceiling above them collapsed. Tons of concrete and metal, killing both instantly, buried under the rubble. Above, on the technical floors, a team of 3 workers was performing night maintenance on the elevators. One of them, Miguel, 28, noticed smoke coming from the main elevator shaft. "Something's wrong," he murmured. He opened the access door and was engulfed by a tongue of fire that exploded from the shaft. His scream was lost in the roar of the flames. The second worker ran, but the fire was faster, climbing through the hydraulic system. On the elevator control panel, the temperature reached a critical point, causing an electrical discharge that made the motor explode, scattering incandescent steel fragments like deadly shrapnel. Meanwhile, in the main lobby, 3 Japanese tourists entered, laughing, filming the monumental architecture of the newly inaugurated building. The receptionist, distracted by her cell phone, didn't notice the cloud of smoke beginning to seep through the fire door's cracks. On the lobby ceiling, the sprinklers remained motionless, decorative, installed only to impress in promotional photos. None of them were connected to a real system. On the party terrace, champagne continued to flow, the music muffling the first siren that failed to sound. Richard Kellerman raised his glass, proud, when, in the distance, someone shouted, "Smoke!" But the shout was muffled by the collective laughter after the toast. Jack, coughing violently, tried to reach the intercom in the basement. When he lifted the cover, he saw only burnt wires and smoke. Without thinking, he grabbed the iron bar from the cart, which he used to open jammed doors, and ran towards the stairwell. Before he could open the fire door, another explosion shook the basement. The auxiliary generator's poorly installed gas system exploded in a fireball. The shockwave threw Jack against the wall, opening a wound on his forehead. The heat was unbearable. Beside him, the cleaning cart melted as if it were made of wax. In a panic, he kicked the fire door hard, which gave way, and he launched himself into the emergency stairwell. The lights failed, and for an instant, the only thing guiding him was instinct and the acrid smell of smoke. On the 5th floor, a family, father, mother, and a small girl, was leaving one of the luxury apartments to go to the heated pool on the 10th. The elevator arrived, the doors opened, and the shaft was a flaming furnace. The father, in front, didn't even have time to scream. The explosion of the control box consumed him. The mother, in shock, pulled the girl back, but the corridor quickly filled with smoke. In the building's monitoring room on the 20th floor, The night manager uselessly pressed all the buttons on the security panel. As he watched, system failed. Alerts repeat on the screen. When he tried to evacuate, the automatic doors of his room locked due to an electrical failure. He was trapped, desperately banging on the glass as he watched the flames approach through the corridor. Jack ran up, stumbling, blood streaming down his face as he shouted, "Is anyone there? Evacuate! Fire!" But the building, immense and silent, seemed to ignore him, like a sleeping beast now awakening in fury. Smoke began to spread through the elevators, stairs, and air ducts, invading apartments, offices, meeting rooms. In minutes, the 80-story building was a death trap. Silent, burning, relentless. At the top, Kellerman laughed at a joke told by Jennifer Cross while the fire had already reached the 10th floor. And Jack, alone, injured, without communication, without help, climbed the stairwell with a single thought: save whoever I can, or die trying. As Jack Morrison stumbled up the emergency stairwell, each step was a struggle against the thickening smoke, thick as burnt oil, clinging to his lungs like invisible hands. He pressed the wound on his forehead with the sleeve of his janitor's uniform, but blood was already running down his face, mixing with sweat and soot. Behind him, a new explosion. The chemical reservoir in the basement gave way under the heat's pressure, transforming the corridors into a furnace. The security cameras captured the final flash before the wires completely melted, leaving the building blind, deaf, and mute. On the 8th floor, a group of young executives from a startup held an impromptu meeting celebrating the company's first $1 million contract. The glass-enclosed room offered a spectacular view of the city, but no one noticed when, from the corner of the ceiling, a trail of black smoke began to trickle down, like ink spilled by a vengeful god. One of the young men coughed and made a joke. The laughter suddenly died as the lights exploded, glass shards fell from the ceiling, and a fireball shot through the air duct, consuming 2 of them instantly. The survivors ran for the exit, but the automated door locked upon detecting the fire alarm, a system that, to cut costs, had been configured to contain the fire by blocking access without considering human evacuation. They banged with their hands, screamed, but the fire arrived first, covering the glass wall like an incandescent curtain until, one by one, the screams ceased. On the 12th floor, a Filipino nanny ran through the corridors, pulling 2 small children by their arms, 5-year-old, twins who were asleep when the alarm failed. The smoke already made it impossible to see more than 2 meters ahead. She tried to access the elevator, but the panel flashed red. Out of service. Desperate, she broke down an emergency door with her shoulder and threw herself down the stairs, descending 3 floors before the flames blocked the way. With no escape, she held them tight against her chest, whispering in her native language, "Forgive me." As the smoke closed like a silent shroud around them. On the 25th floor, a group of employees worked the night shift. Janitors, IT technicians, drivers waiting for their bosses. When smoke began to invade the break room, someone ran to the window, trying to break it with a chair. The glass, bulletproof and triple-layered, resisted. But when the chair finally opened a crack, oxygen rushed in and fed the invisible flame already hiding in the ceiling. The room exploded, throwing bodies across furniture, igniting papers, curtains, and synthetic carpets, all fueling the flame that now seemed to have a will of its own. On the 35th floor, a man desperately tried to guide his pregnant wife to the stairwell. "Just a few more floors," he shouted, holding her hand tightly. But she fell to her knees, breathless, clutching her belly. The heat was unbearable, the oxygen scarce. He tried to carry her, but stumbled on a broken step, hitting his head against the wall. Blood, dizziness. The last image he saw was the flame taking over the handrail as if it were a fiery serpent, crawling towards him. Meanwhile, at the top of the building, in the ballroom, the muffled sound of classical music mixed with the crackle of flames now climbing through the elevators like an invisible army. The maitre d', finally noticing the acrid smell discreetly invading the hall, approached Richard Kellerman, leaning in to warn him, "Sir, I think there's a problem. We'll talk about it later," Kellerman replied with a bored smile, raising another glass. On the opposite side of the hall, Tom Bradley was live streaming, walking with his back to the large glass wall. Behind him, through the impeccable glass, a column of black smoke was already seen rising from the east side of the building. His followers sent emojis and applause while, ironically, he said, "Look at this building, guys. A spectacle. The future." But the future already had a name: death. On the 40th floor, Frank O'Brien, a veteran security guard, already advanced with his flashlight through the office area, noticing that the smell was becoming denser and denser. He found 2 employees trapped in a room whose automatic lock did not respond. Using all his strength, he broke down the door with the metal rod he always carried. They emerged coughing, eyes wide, as Frank shouted, "Get out! Run! The building is on fire." He knew the south stairwell must already be compromised. He then decided to head for the north stairwell, but a blast of hot smoke exploded when he opened the door, burning his arm. He screamed in pain, but remained standing. Not now, not him. Higher up, on the 50th floor, the fire broke through a false wall that hid exposed wires. The cheap insulation caught fire in seconds, creating a chimney effect that further accelerated the ascent of the flames. Jack, panting, reached the 10th floor when he heard the first cry of panic coming from above. Someone realized, too late, that there was nowhere to run. And so, the entire building, this monumental work of ambition and predatory economy, transformed, floor by floor, into a death trap. Jack looked up, the orange glow reflected on the metal walls, and shouted, "Is anyone there?" The echo replied, "Anyone there? There!" But above him, the fire climbed faster than any man could run. And there, at that moment, Jack Morrison knew. It wouldn't just be a fire, it would be a massacre. Jack Morrison already knew. The descent was blocked. The fire was turning the building into a vertical labyrinth, where every path could be a deadly trap. He climbed, driven not by the hope of escape, but by the irrevocable decision to try and save whoever could still be saved. And then, on the 17th floor, he heard something beyond the crackling of structures and the roar of the flames. A scream, faint, muffled by the smoke, coming from one of the side corridors. Jack hesitated for a second. And you? What would you do? Ignore it to ensure your survival, or risk everything to help? Comment. We want to know. Would you run, or would you go back? Jack went back. He followed the sound until he found a locked door. He tried the handle, unsuccessfully. He pulled an emergency metal bar and broke it open. There, sitting against the wall, coughing, eyes half closed by the smoke, was a man. Tall, thin, with singed clothes and a look that mixed despair and lucidity. "Help!" he whispered, almost voiceless. Jack pulled him out, leading him to the stairwell, where the air, even poisoned, was less deadly. "Can you walk?" he asked, supporting him. The man nodded, but his breathing was short, labored. "What's your name?" Jack insisted as he helped him up. The man only replied, "It doesn't matter. What matters is that I know this building. I know a way." Jack stared at him, incredulous. "There's a route through the technical floors, behind the maintenance rooms. No one else knows. And here, another reflection for you who are watching. How many times in life do we find help in the most improbable places? How many times does the unknown become our only chance? Would you trust him? Would you risk following someone you just met in the middle of chaos? Write in the comments. Would you follow or try alone?" Jack didn't hesitate. "Show me the one way," he said. And so the two set off together down the side corridor as the fire advanced inexorably. Along the way, between broken steps, smoke, and the sound of yielding beams, the man guided Jack through hidden passages, narrow maintenance, tunnels, abandoned service stairs, technical corridors ignored even by the building staff. Every step was a risk. Every second, a battle against the fire and against fear itself. And you? How would you be now? Trembling, paralyzed, or moving forward, determined, like them? Jack, sweating, panting, supported the man when he faltered. At one point, crossing a wiring compartment, they heard a roar, Behind them, the entire floor collapsed, swallowed by the flames. There was no turning back. The man looked at Jack with a brief smile, almost of relief. "I told you, it's the only way." And they continued, until finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they saw a reinforced emergency staircase hidden behind a technical panel. "This will take us to the rooftop," the man said, his voice failing. Jack held him firmly. "Let's go." And they began the final ascent. But what they still didn't know was that on the rooftop, the party guests hadn't even realized that death already surrounded them, and that the path to them would still hold more trials, more losses, and more impossible choices. And now, before we continue, if this story is moving you, if you believe in the importance of difficult decisions, courage, altruism, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share. Because stories like these remind us, heroism is not born from the certainty of victory, but from the choice to act, even when all seems lost. Take a deep breath. The fire has not yet finished taking its toll. In the next few minutes, you will see what Jack and the mysterious man will face in the final ascent. And once again, I ask you, what would you do in their place? Write in the comments. Your courage can inspire others. The climb up the technical ladder was a battle of endurance. Jack Morrison felt every muscle burn, every breath tear his lungs like invisible blades. The mysterious man beside him stumbled, coughed, but did not stop. The heat was not just physical, it was psychological, a constant presence reminding them. There was no room for error. With each flight of stairs conquered, new threats emerged. On the 40th floor, an explosion on one of the lower floors shook the structure. The entire building trembled, like a wounded animal about to collapse. The mysterious man held onto the metal railing, looking at Jack with a mixture of fear and defiance. "It won't last much longer," he said, between coughs. Jack just nodded. There was no more room for words. As they opened one of the maintenance doors, they were met by a blast of smoke and the sound of beams creaking. The corridor ahead was partially blocked by debris. Jack went first, dragging a smaller beam to clear a path. The man tried to help, but staggered, falling to his knees. "Go without me," he murmured, but Jack pulled him firmly. "Either we go together, or we don't go." And they continued, passing under tilted beams, dodging high-voltage cables that crackled with sparks like electrical snakes. On the 45th floor, they found the first insurmountable obstacle. Part of the ceiling had collapsed, completely blocking the technical corridor. Jack looked at the man, who just pointed up. "We have to cross through the elevator shaft." It was suicide, but it was the only chance. Jack helped the man climb to an opening in the wall, where, with effort, they removed part of the plasterboard and metal structure. From there, they saw the elevator shaft, a black abyss, cut by steel cables and smoke. The only route, cross, balancing on the side cables until reaching the other side, where a small maintenance platform would lead them to the next ladder. Jack swallowed hard. He looked at the man and said, "I'll go first." He turned to those watching now. "And you? Would you have the courage to cross this abyss, with fire consuming you from behind?" Leave it in the comments. Jack launched himself, firmly holding the cable, advancing inch by inch, feeling the heat radiate from the walls. When he reached the other side, he took a deep breath and signaled for the man to cross. The man hesitated, but taking a deep breath, began the crossing. In the middle of the journey, the building shook again. The man lost his balance for a second, slipping. Jack lunged, holding him by the arm, pulling him hard until both fell onto the platform on the other side, panting but alive. No time to celebrate, they continued. On the 50th floor, they found the final ladder, but the path was not clear. Part of the sidewall gave way, releasing a tongue of fire that forced them to retreat. Jack grabbed an emergency fire blanket, wrapped himself and the man in it, and ran through the unbearable heat, feeling their skin almost burning despite the improvised protection. When they reached the other side, the man dropped to the ground. Exhausted, Jack knelt beside him. "We're almost there." The man just smiled weakly. "I told you there was a way." Jack squeezed his shoulder with silent gratitude. He looked up, Above, the access to the rooftop, the last flight of stairs. But what they still didn't know was that on the rooftop, panic had already begun. Guests were running, screams echoed, and escape routes were rapidly closing. And before we continue, do you believe Jack and the mysterious man will make it in time? Leave it in the comments. Now take a deep breath, because the fire doesn't wait, and time is running out. Jack and the mysterious man reached the top of the stairwell, their bodies exhausted, their lungs ravaged by smoke. They pushed open the rooftop door and were swallowed by a scene of pure chaos. The luxurious hall, moments ago filled with laughter and toasts, was now a field of screams, running, and despair. Flames were already insinuating themselves along the sides, consuming the expensive curtains, licking the cold marble with contempt. The heat was unbearable, and the air heavy and poisonous. Among the people running aimlessly, some stumbled and fell. Others shouted names that were lost in the turmoil. In the midst of this human collapse, one figure remained standing. An elderly lady, her hair tied in a simple bun, her eyes calm, her breathing serene. She stood over a fallen table, her hands raised, her soft voice cutting through the panic with an authority that came not from physical strength, but from spiritual strength. "Listen, calm down," she said, and although the words were simple, there was in them an impossible piece to ignore. We cannot control the flames, but we can choose not to let them burn our soul. Some stopped, others fell silent. Jack observed for an instant how that woman, fragile before the fire, raised an invisible wall against fear. She continued, "Close your eyes, breathe. The fire wants our haste, it wants our despair. But if we remain firm, our soul will remain intact." Jack approached, his gaze admiring. She looked at him sweetly, like someone who recognizes not a savior, but an equal. And then she said, like one entrusting a secret, "You came to guide us." Jack felt the weight of those words, but also the lightness of someone who, even in the midst of chaos, finds purpose. He nodded, without needing to reply. The lady turned to the others, extending her arms as if embracing the collective. "Follow whoever knows the way, and remember, whoever remains calm has already won half the battle." In that instant, Jack understood. The fire there was not just physical destruction, but the living metaphor of what so often consumes us from within. Fear, haste, despair. He took a deep breath. He looked at the survivors, Jennifer, Tom, Kellerman, all stripped of their social masks, reduced to the essential, human beings, fragile and determined. "This way," he said, pointing to the route he and the mysterious man had discovered. The lady smiled, placed her hand over her chest, and as the others began to follow Jack, she stayed, kneeling beside a young woman in tears, embracing her with silent affection. Jack led the group through the hall, dodging debris, growing flames, and suffocating smoke. The mysterious man, leaning on his shoulder, whispered with gratitude, "Without you, I wouldn't have made it." Jack simply replied, with the tranquility of someone who understood the essential, "Without you, I wouldn't have gotten here." And they continued. They didn't know if they would escape. They didn't know how much time they had left, but they knew they had made the only possible choice: to move forward with courage and dignity, despite the fear, despite the chaos. And in the background, even as the fire roared, the lady's firm voice could still be heard. "Do not fear. God is with us, even here." And then they crossed the last frontier, the one that separates those who succumb from those who resist. Jack led the group along the improvised route, their steps heavy, their faces marked by terror and the hope that insisted on not dying. With each meter advanced, the fire seemed to get closer, as if the building itself wanted to drag them into its depths. On the maintenance terrace, the last obstacle awaited them, an open space, a 15-meter gap separating the Vertex Tower from the neighboring building. Jack looked down, 50 floors of emptiness, an abyss cut by the wind and the reflection. of the flames. Beside him, the maintenance cables, the only possible bridge between life and death. Jack tested them, fragile, taut, but still supporting weight. He turned to the group. "We'll cross, one at a time." Tom, the influencer, was the first to volunteer. The man who once lived to be seen now crossed the abyss in silence, helping others on the opposite side without showing off, without expecting applause. Jennifer followed, her eyes firm, leaving behind not only the party, but also the calculating coldness that had always guided her decisions. David Sterling, trembling, almost didn't make it, but was pushed not by Jack, but by his own conscience. For the first time, moved not by profit, but by the will to survive with dignity. The elderly lady who guided them spiritually did not cross. She stayed, sitting beside a couple in shock, whispering prayers, refusing to abandon those who could no longer move. Jack tried to convince her, but she only smiled. "My mission is over. It's up to you now." And there she remained, serene, as the fire approached, a figure of unshakable peace, embracing those who couldn't escape. The mysterious man, staggering, refused Jack's help. "You've done enough." And with effort, he crossed the cable, being pulled by Tom on the other side, falling exhausted but alive. Jack looked back one last time. The hall was already a furnace, structures giving way, flames consuming what remained of the party, the masks, the illusion of security. He crossed the cable. When he reached the other building, he knelt, panting, and then looked up. The Vertex Tower, now completely consumed by fire, a burning column illuminating the Manhattan night. Sirens echoed, helicopters hovered, but it was too late for those who remained. The survivors embraced, silent, without celebrating, just relieved and, above all, transformed. Tom looked at Jack and said, with a brief smile, "You saved us." But Jack shook his head. "No, we saved each other." And there was the lesson the fire could not destroy, that true salvation is not in individual strength, but in the human capacity to unite, to act, to resist, even when all seems lost. Jennifer, with tears in her eyes, picked up the phone and called the authorities, not as an executive, but as a citizen. Sterling, wrapped in a blanket, couldn't say anything. He just kept looking at the flames, understanding, perhaps for the first time, the weight of every decision. The mysterious man held Jack's arm and said, "I never knew what courage was, until today." Jack smiled with the serenity of someone who had found what he had been looking for years. Not public redemption, but the silent peace of having done what was right, even without guarantees. As the building collapsed in the distance, Jack remained, standing, looking at the sky, breathing deeply, feeling not the smell of smoke, but the taste of life that, once again, prevailed over death. Because in the end, fire consumes, destroys, takes. But there's something it never reaches: the courage of those who choose to act, the solidarity of those who reach out, the hope of those who keep going. And that, yes, is the flame that never dies. And now, before we close, take a deep breath and think about them. About the men and women who every day face what everyone else runs from. Not to be heroes, not to win medals, but because they know that when the fire starts, there's no time to hesitate. They go in. They save. They often don't come back. This video is more than a catastrophe story. It's a silent, burning, and eternal tribute to firefighters, to those who carry not only hoses and equipment, but the weight of responsibility, courage, sacrifice. If at any point in this story you were moved, if you felt the strength of courage or the fragility of life, like it, subscribe to the channel. Share this video, not for us, but for them. For every firefighter who chose to enter the fire when they could have stayed safe, for every life saved, and for those who, even if they couldn't be saved, were honored by the attempt. May this story serve to never forget that not every hero wears a cape. Some wear uniforms, helmets, and face hell so others can live. Thank you, firefighters. And thank you for staying until the end. Until the next story. Until the next flame.